Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read because we are in the month of Spooktober. It is horror themed, and today's book is all about ghost and mental health. I am referring to The Sleep Room by F.R. Tallis, which was published in 2013. For those who don't know, F.R. Tallis, or Frank Tallis, is an American author who has written quite a bit of, or like a little bit of nonfiction, or a little bit of fiction, but has written nonfiction because in their in a past life or in their still current life, they are a psychiatrist, which I think is fascinating. But it does also influence maybe some of their writing. Like when they were doing research and whatnot, they focused on obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia, and they got published as a result of that. It seems like at some point they decided to switch over to writing fiction. That was somewhat influenced by the field of psychiatry, and they ended up writing a couple horror-themed books, and that includes The Sleep Room here, which seems to have won a little bit of positive regard. Don't know too much else about Frank or F.R. Tallis. Seems to be an interesting author. And I would be interested in checking out some of their other work, although I do have a few problems with the story that I'm going to be talking about today. And as per usual, I will be talking about this book in great detail, especially in the summary section. So if you intend to read it, make sure you go do that first and then come back and check the video. And without further ado, I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Sleep Room focuses on James Richardson. He is an English psychiatrist working in the United Kingdom, and at the start of the story, first it takes place sometime between the 1950s and 1970s. The timeline is a bit unclear. But he interviews for a superintendent position at Wild Hope, a mental health hospital, and he interviews with a man named Dr. Maitland, who is very well regarded in his field. And James ends up getting the job, and he moves to live on site at the facility. When he's there, he learns that Dr. Maitland is working on an experiment called the Sleep Room, where some of the more disturbed patients with problematic histories, including those with schizophrenia, are put in the sleep room. Essentially, they're made to go to sleep for months on end in the hopes that will destroy their personality and help them forget some more problematic memories, and that way they'll be healed when they finally wake up. And James has a few problems with this, but he doesn't really express them, and he goes along with the experiment. But as the experiment goes along, he begins hearing strange noises throughout the hospital that he can't quite explain, and even some of the patients and the staff begin acting strangely because they notice this too, but no one ever fully expresses what they think might be going on. Although James has thoughts of poltergeist, how this place might be haunted, and at first he thinks that can't be the logical answer, and then later he thinks, well, it might be the answer, but I'm having a good time at this job, and it's providing me with a lot of skills that I can then usher into my next job, so I won't have to remain here for very long, which I think is quite funny. And during this time, he also enters into a relationship with one of the nurses, a woman named Jane, and it even reaches a point where he thinks he might propose to her, but he finds out that she was maybe in a relationship with Dr. Maitland, and that sort of changes his entire perspective on her for some unknown reason. One of the other nurses, a woman named Mary Williams, begins becoming distraught as she works more and more in the sleep room. And then one day she just dashes out of the hospital while she's supposed to be watching it at night. And they end up finding her body where she's drowned in a local body of water. And it appears that she was like tearing off her clothes and whatnot. And James suspects that it might have something to do with the poltergeist. And further strange things happen around Christmas, where all the nurses begin developing fevers, and James is left pretty much on his own. One of the patients, Michael Chapman, is pretty close to James. They develop somewhat of a friendship, and he becomes increasingly paranoid over the story relating to the sleep room and also the potential poltergeist in the hospital. And during Christmas, he straight up runs towards James's side of the hospital. And he begins expressing that he sees like a ghostly visitor, which James can also see. Michael waves a knife around, but James persuades him to give it back to him once the ghostly visitor is gone. And then a short while later, James finds letters that are addressed to Maitland about the people in the sleep room, and noting that they're people with problematic histories of abortion and parental abandonment. And there's at least one who has a memo from the CIA in their file. And James finds that suspicious, but he never investigates that further. And then Michael Chapman, a short while later, feels and like he's kind of reached his breaking point, and to sort of get him to calm down, they try to give him medicine, which doesn't work, and then they put him into an isolated room because he's banging his head against the wall, and puts him in a straitjacket. But when they look on him later, they find that the straitjacket has been ripped off and his eyes have been torn out, and so they send him to a hospital where James doesn't see him again. After this, James is surprised to find that the sleep room patients are in comas, and Dr. Maitland comes and visits and checks on them to make sure that that this experiment is going well. James confronts Maitland and notes that these patients should be transferred to another hospital because the mental health facility is not equipped to deal with what they need. But Maitland shrugs this off and even suggests that he might blackmail James if for some of the stuff that happened at the hospital if he doesn't go along with this experiment. And at that point, Wild Hope catches fire mysteriously, which might have been due to the poltergeist. Everyone is able to leave, but James watches through like the door peephole of the sleep room as he's unable to open it, and watches as all the sleep room patients kind of sit up in their beds and exact a sort of torment on Dr. Maitland as they all presumably burn alive. James Richardson is able to leave the hospital, and he tries to move on with his life, finding a different job in London and in various cities. But he feels kind of torn, or like drawn back to the remnants of the hospital, that he needs a sort of closure, and he ends up going to the hospital, seeing a distant figure in a surviving window, feeling a little bit of terror in the process. And then he goes home and he has a dream that suggests that he was in the hospital, that he might have been a patient himself, that he were under Maitland. And when he wakes up, he thinks about what Michael Chapman was saying about the hospital, or was saying about dreams, that an old Chinese parable about how a man dreams he's a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he questions, was he a man dreaming that he was a butterfly, or was he a butterfly that is now dreaming that he is a man? And James is a bit scared about that, and that's sort of where the story ends. But then in the next chapter, Tallis kind of explains, or like spells it out for you what he's talking about. And we see a letter from Hugh Maitland asking if another psychologist can take on his client or his patient, James Richardson, who the sleep room isn't really working for him anymore. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with the sleep room. One of the things we're talking about is the ghostly presence in the story. I believe that Tallis does a really good job of setting up this ghostly presence and presenting some truly scary moments that really add to the horror vibe that is present in this story. Wild Hope is haunted by something, although we don't quite know what it is at first, and it's not a traditional haunting, which I think is very interesting. There are strange noises that nobody can explain or even wants to explain. It's sort of the mind trying to distance itself from the horror that it's experiencing. Misplaced items like a ring. James keeps finding rings in various places and doesn't know who they are. Sometimes they're phantom rings and whatnot. And then phantom visitors. When he's in his room in a part that's not a hospital, he hears footsteps in his room, but he can't see anyone there. And sometimes he sees a silhouette of someone, but when he turns on the light, again, no one is there. And it's a truly horrifying feeling because he doesn't quite know what the motives are of these phantom visitors. Like, he believes that they might have drowned Mary Williams, but he doesn't know what they want for him, and it's a very creepy kind of feeling that kind of leads him to think maybe I should leave. But anytime he thinks that, he worries that that might affect the experiment or affect his ability to get a job outside of this hospital. There is an interesting quote that I would like to read to you about this. I clutched the blanket tightly, but it began to slip from my fingers. There was a sudden wrench and my protective cover was whipped away. The top sheet, blanket, and eiderdown flew across the room and landed heavily near the window. I was naked and my sudden exposure reminded me of how cold it was. The fear that had its origin in the lighthouse dream continued to compromise my ability to take action, and I remained in a state of petrified immobility. If human beings possess a sixth sense, then it must have been through this channel that I received impression of movement, something traveling from the far corner of the room past the foot of the bed and then coming to a standstill beside me, which is quite terrifying. I do have to give Tallis credit for building up the horror and suspense here. It is a very slow story, but as Tallis is building up the horror, he really gives you the like a creepy sensation of all of this happening, of not knowing the motives of the ghost and or what seems like ghost. And as I just mentioned, like, is it truly a ghost? Because there could have been a haunting here. Like, there could have been someone who died. It's certainly possible that Maitland got someone killed in the past, and that presence is now haunting the hospital. But more realistically, or not more realistically, but another possible option is that it's a projected psychic sort of experience, because some of the patients were described as having latent psychic abilities. Whether or not that's actually true remains to be seen, but what Richardson thinks is happening by the end of the story is that the sleep room patients have all started operating on the same wavelength, and this allows them to project images or sort of push things telekinetically. And so the ghostly presence that's haunting the hospital is actually the sleep room patients trying to reach out and connect with somebody because they've been forcibly put asleep for months on end. And so this is them trying to get help for that, trying to get someone to unlock or take them away from Maitland's terrifying experiment. And as I mentioned before, this is pretty terrifying because Richardson doesn't really know how to react to any of this, and it feels deeply unsettling to see some of the stuff that's happening in the story. It also seems like Tallis is trying to talk about the ethics of the sleep room, which would make sense because Tallis Tallis was or is or currently working as a psychiatrist in real life, and so he would know the ethics and the legal rules of this type of experiment. And it's certainly him trying to reflect on the Wild West science of the past, because in the 50s and 60s there were a lot of weird experiments that weren't necessarily completely ethical and resulted in harm to the people who were being who they were being done on. Like, they weren't given informed consent or anything like that, and so they were just subjected to something that might have had long-term effects that weren't really good for them. And so Tallis is examining this, and he's showing us how the patients are put into months of forced sleep, which again wouldn't really, I don't think that would really fly today. And then he focuses on medication over actually providing care. Given this takes place in the 1950s, and at least in the field of psychotherapy, there were a couple people at the time who were developing ideas, like I forget his name, but he focused on Carl Rogers. He focused on humanism in the field of psychology, focusing on the client as a whole, and not really thinking or not really seeing their mental illness as who they were, but working to help them become better. And it doesn't seem like Maitland in this story is really focusing on that. He really only cares about the patients in the sleep room, because there are patients all around the hospital who are not part of this experiment. And whenever he comes to visit, he doesn't really pay that much attention to them. They seem like extraneous, and when he hears one of them is in danger, Michael Chapman, or like when he gets hurt, he's just like, oh, that's unfortunate, and just seems to move on. For him, his experiment and the possibility of becoming more famous than he already is, more notable, is what matters to him most, which is definitely not a very ethical way to be a psychiatrist. And so we do have to ask, is Maitland malicious in this story, or is he just overly ambitious? Like, is he actively trying to harm these patients in order to perfect some sort of experiment, which it does seem like he is. And given that we found a CIA memo, or like given that Richardson found the CIA memo in one of the files, it really does seem like he's interested in money or accolades here, and that would make him malicious. But it could also just be that he's accidentally ambitious, where he's trying to build upon his own legacy, but he's doing that at the benefit of others by creating an experiment, creating a type of therapy that could benefit people in the long run, especially those who are particularly disturbed and for who regular therapy does not work. But in the end, like, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you hurt people, you're still hurting those people. And we forget that these patients are actually people, that they have lives outside of this experiment. And Maitland doesn't really seem to care about that. He's only focused on the end result. These people are a means to an end. And we do have to think about the choice of the patients. Again, they're very disturbed, but also, as noted in the files, like, these are people who have been kind of put on the margins of society, abandoned by family, no one really left to turn to, low socioeconomic status due to their overall condition. And so, it seems like Maitland might think that you can exploit these people because nobody will come looking for them, which is what has happened very often in psychology, very often in science, those type of people being exploited. So to some extent, Tallis is talking about the ethics and the past of his own field that he's been working in. I do also like the gloomy setting of the story. It creates a feeling of really no hope. It adds to the overall horror sort of setting, kind of touching a little bit upon Edgar Allan Poe with his sort of gothic kind of setting, except this takes place in London, and there is a bit of sun, which you don't often see in Edgar Allan Poe stories. Just the atmosphere of the hospital mixed with the foggy and unclear sort of setting around the hospital and in the city and whatnot, it sort of feels like this is a dream of some sort, or it feels like he's in a sort of limbo state of something like that. So and not very good for Richardson here, and adding to the overall horror. And then there's the question of what is reality here, because as Michael Chapman says earlier in the story, like he's wondering what exactly is real and what is a dream. Specifically, he starts pinching himself because he questions whether or not what the reality that he's living is a dream. He talks about the Chinese parable of the man who dreamt that he was a butterfly, and when he woke up, he questioned whether or not he was a man dreaming of the butterfly or the butterfly dreaming that he was a man. What is the true reality there? And Tallis adds to that at the end of the story by having Richardson dream that he was a patient under Maitland, and that he was married to Nurse Jane, but she left him because she could no longer deal with him in the sleep therapy experiment. So the question then would become, what is that reality? It's a very good question, sort of adding to the overall story. I do think that it's a little bit obvious, because when I checked this out from my local library, I was like, oh, is the twist going to be he was in the sleep room the entire time? And it feels like that is kind of where Tallis was leading. And I think if he had left it there, the story would be very brilliant, very amazing. A lot to think about, and a truly horrific kind of ending where you have to is that going to be the thing that drives Richardson crazy? It certainly seems like it. But of course, the problem here, and the big problem, is that Tallis at the very end kind of writes it out for you. He's like, oh, he presents it, and then the next chapter he's like, oh, this is what I actually meant. And it's like, well, I could kind of see that we were getting at that in the previous chapter, and if you left it there, again, it would be great. But then, because he spells it out for you, it feels kind of hack in that way, like bad writing. It undermines the ending of the story by kind of insulting the audience and making them feel like oh, you did not think we were smart enough to get this. So it kind of ruins the ending in a way. But also, by leaving it ambiguous, you have that question of what is your reality, and it could, without knowing, it could lead you to become insane. But if you just spell it out, it's like, oh, well, that's certainly interesting that's happened. It feels like I've been lied to the entire story now, but it feels like a weaker ending, in my opinion, because it doesn't fall in line with the themes that Tallis has been working on. And then there's a couple of other wonky things in the story. It does feel a bit dry at times, which can make it hard to get through for the average person. And James does feel inconsequential in the story. It's a haunting. He's just dealing with the ghost, and Maitland seems to push him over at times. He doesn't really do anything to stop Maitland in this story. In fact, the entire experiment is stopped because a ghostly fire breaks out and destroys the hospital. And James doesn't really seem to have any control in this story, so he's a bit of a weak kind of protagonist figure here. And then there's also a bit of sexism, which might have been intentional on Tallis's part, because the way that James treats Nurse Turner, as well as how the other nurses are presented in the story, they don't really feel as important as the men. And it's also important to note that, again, I think all of the patients in the sleep room are women, people who have been cast to the margins of society and whatnot. And again, this all might be intentional on Tallis, but part of me feels like it's not. Like, this is how Tallis sees women, especially the nurses in this story, but I don't have any proof of that, but I just wanted to make that known there. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Sleep Room by F.R. Tallis. An interesting horror book, the one that is a fun addition to Spooktober, but I do have a lot of problems with the ending that I just can't seem to get over. It takes what should have been an amazing book with something to think about and turns it into a parlor trick. Like here's the ending. It could have been amazing, but there's just something missing from it in the end. And we know exactly what is missing. So if you find this at your local library, maybe check it out, but I wouldn't suggest you go out and buy it. Especially because I don't think many other people will like the ending. Or maybe you will. Maybe I just have a problem with the fundamental nature and how it kind of takes away from the story. If you read this before, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Would love to hear from you and have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And also join the Discord if you want to talk more about books or movies. There's a link to it down in the description. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sleepy travels. Farewell.